49, Chapter 35. The entire dining hall full of boys gasped. He was hiding in the nurse's office, Mr. Talbot was saying, and the other one's over at the girls' school. Come on, I don't want to miss my golf game this afternoon. No! Jason roared. Even in chains, he had a commanding presence. The police officer with the chest full of medals turned to look at him with something like respect. I told you I'm not an X-nay. I can show you the X-nays. Jason stepped forward, chains rattling. Mr. Talbot reached out to grab his arm, but the officer stopped him. Maybe he's right, the officer said. I always love it when they betray each other. And I wouldn't mind getting a bonus for exceeding my quota this month. Mr. Talbot shrugged and looked at his watch, as if all that worried him was showing up late for his tea time. Jason hobbled slowly across the room until he reached Luke's table. Luke felt faint. Everyone around him seemed to be holding his breath, too. Jason pointed. Him, Antonio Blanco is his real name, but he goes by Samuel Irving. Him, Denton Weathers, alias Travis Spencer. Him, Sherman Kymansky, alias Ryan Mann. Him, Patrick Kerrigan, alias Tyrone Jansen. Now Jason pointed to Luke. And him, I don't know his real name, but he's pretending to be Lee Grant. He turned back to the population police officer beseechingly. And I know there are more, just give me some time. Mr. Talbot started laughing. His guffaws rang out in the silent dining hall like bells after a funeral. Lee Grant, an imposter? Now that's a good one. I've known Lee since he was a baby. His whole family used to celebrate Christmas with mine back when we lived in the city. Come to think of it, I've got one or two of those Christmas pictures in my wallet right now. Want to see them? Mr. Talbot asked the police officer. He was already pulling the wallet out of his back pocket. Hey, Lee, good to see you. Come look. Remember the year your parents made you wear the Santa Claus hat? Somehow Luke managed to make his legs carry him over to Mr. Talbot. Once before, Mr. Talbot had lied and said that he was a close personal friend of Luke's father's cousin. That was dangerous enough. Mr. Talbot could never back up this lie. But the picture Mr. Talbot thrust at him was crystal clear. There was Mr. Talbot and 3 other adults standing by a fireplace, 2 boys that Luke recognized as Jen's brothers. Mr. Talbot's stepsons sat on the hearth, and there, right between them, was Luke in a flannel shirt and a Santa hat. Mr. Talbot even flashed the photo in front of Jason's face. But I know, Jason fumed. I'm sure of the others, I'm positive. Uh-huh, Mr. Talbot said. I bet you just made up those names trying to save your own skin. Suddenly, Patrick/Tyrone spoke up. He is, sir. My name is really Robert Jones. I'm Michael Reistert, Sherman/Ryan added. The other 2 gave different names too, Joel Weston and John Abbott. All 4 boys spoke in calm, even voices. Luke was stunned. What was going on? How could they possibly pull this off? They're lying! Look at their records, Jason screamed. Good idea, Mr. Talbot said. Is there a teacher or administrator who would be so kind? At a far table, Luke's history teacher, Mr. Dirk, stood up. Just give me a minute, he said. Luke wondered how he could have ever found the man intimidating. He scurried out of the room like a mouse. In no time at all, he returned with 4 thick files. He handed them to the police officer. Mind, please don't let any of the boys see. We'd like to keep their records private. But everyone was craning his neck, straining to see. Luke had the advantage because he was still standing next to Mr. Talbot. The police officer flipped quickly through the top file. Luke could see Michael written again and again on each page. And in the next file, it was Robert, over and over and over. They're fake, Jason howled. Who could have faked these? In the 2 minutes we were standing here, the police officer said in disgust. He threw the files down on the table and jerked on Jason's arm. Come on, out of here. Enough of your lies. We'd better go make that other pickup quick, or Mr. Talbot here will make me reimburse him for his lost greens time. But, Jason sputtered all the way out of the dining room. And then he and Mr. Talbot and the population police officer were gone. Chapter 36. It was strange, after everything that had happened, that the boys could shuffle off to their classes as usual. The hall monitors watched as usual. Once the bell rang, the teachers cleared their throats as dryly as ever and began lecturing about integral numbers or laws of thermodynamics or long-dead poets. Luke took his history exam that afternoon, as scheduled. He was surprised that he could pencil in responses about Hercules and Achilles, Hannibal and Arthur, heroes of the distant past, even as his mind raced with questions about the present. He longed to ask Patrick/Tyrone, no, make that Robert now, for an explanation, or any of the others. How had they known the right names to say? How had their records been changed? How was it that nobody in the entire dining room had stood up to challenge their stories? And who had betrayed Jason? But each time he saw the other boys, they only groaned about their exams, complained about the school food, told stupid jokes. They acted like their names had always been Michael, Robert, Joel, and John. Nobody mentioned Jason. Are we going to the woods tonight? Luke whispered to Trey as they were leaving dinner. To talk about, you know. Trey looked at him as though Luke was speaking a foreign language. Guess not, huh? Luke said, unable to just let it go. Luke felt an arm on his shoulder just then. I'd like a word with you, young man, a voice said. With all his fears from breakfast time rushing back, Luke had to force himself to turn around. Mr. Dirk, his history teacher, stood there looking stern. You are Lee Grant, are you not? Mr. Dirk asked. The other boy stepped past him. Luke watched the doors of the lecture hall close before he could bring himself to nod. Then come with me, Mr. Dirk said, and turned on his heel. Luke followed a few paces behind, so Mr. Dirk was going to tell him how badly he'd failed the history exam. So what? Luke remembered that, with Jason gone, there was no one to doctor his grades. But Luke had never cared about the grades. I'll work harder next term, Luke started to say. I didn't even start going to your class until last week. Hush, Mr. Dirk said. Luke fought the urge to giggle. It was so ridiculous that, after surviving the population police raid, he was getting in trouble because he had forgotten the names of a few dead guys most people had never heard of. Mr. Dirk walked past his classroom. Luke started to protest, but Mr. Dirk was walking briskly now. Luke had to hurry to keep up. Mr. Dirk walked right up to the front door and turned the knob. Isn't it locked tonight? Luke wanted to ask. But he was beginning to understand that Mr. Dirk wasn't going to scold him about ancient history. He kept his mouth shut. The door opened easily. Luke and Mr. Dirk stepped outside together. Tiers of steps lay before them in the twilight. Luke remembered his trepidation climbing these very stairs. His first day at Hendrix. They didn't seem quite so imposing now, probably because he was at the top looking down instead of the bottom looking up. Where are we going? Luke couldn't resist asking. For an answer, Mr. Dirk put a finger to his lips. They climbed down the steps and walked along the expansive driveway. June bugs sang far off in the distance. They made Luke homesick. Back on the farm, his dad and brothers were probably just coming in for supper after a hard day bailing. Mother would just be getting home from the factory. It didn't seem right that Luke had just had one of the most terrifying days of his life, and his own family would never know. Watch your step, Mr. Dirk said. Luke had been so lost in thought, he hadn't even noticed that they had turned and were now standing in front of a small cottage. No, not a cottage. The small scale had fooled him. This building had turrets and arches like a castle, but was nestled so neatly behind lilac bushes and rhododendron and forsythia that Luke could have walked right past without seeing it at all. Ring the bell, Mr. Dirk instructed. He turned to go. Luke was swept with panic. Wait, he cried. Mr. Dirk was hardly a comforting figure, but at least he was familiar. Luke didn't like being abandoned in a strange place without explanation. I trust you can find your way back on your own when you are finished, Mr. Dirk said, and disappeared into the shadows. There was nothing for Luke to do but press the doorbell. Come in, a deep voice called from inside. Luke gave the door a little push. It was made of the same kind of heavy wood as all the doors at Hendrix. It barely moved. Timidly, Luke edged it open and stepped inside. A dim room lay before him. Prisms hung from old-fashioned lamps. Wood-framed couches curved between oddly shaped tables cluttered with dozens of framed pictures. Luke didn't even notice the man in the wheelchair until he cleared his throat. Welcome, young man, the man said. He was older than either Luke's parents or Mr. Talbot. He had thick white hair that swelled above his forehead like a snowbank. He wore crisp khaki pants and a pale blue shirt, the same kind of barren clothes Luke had almost become accustomed to wearing himself. Would you care for a drink? Bottled water, perhaps? Luke shook his head, baffled. Questions swarmed in his mind. George, the man called. Mr. Talbot stepped into the room from the back part of the house. Luke's knees went weak with relief. Finally, someone who could explain. Mr. Luke began, but Mr. Talbot shook his head warningly. He waved a long bar in front of Luke's chest and legs, then behind his back. Finally, he leaned back and announced, "He's clean, no bugs." "I hate all this technology, don't you?" the man in the wheelchair said, leaning back as though Mr. Talbot's announcement had freed him to relax. He stirred a cup he held in his hand. Luke thought he caught a whiff of something like the chicory coffee his parents had sometimes drunk as a special treat. "But now I can introduce myself. I'm Josiah Hendricks. You know my friend here, I presume." Luke could only nod. Sit down, Mr. Hendricks said. "No need to stand on ceremony." Luke noticed that Mr. Talbot, always so much in charge every other time Luke had seen him, obeyed instantly. Luke quickly sank into an armchair as well. Mr. Hendricks sipped his drink. "You are an inquisitive young man," he said to Luke. "You wish some explanations, no?" "Yes," Luke said eagerly. He looked over at Mr. Talbot expectantly, but Mr. Talbot was staring pointedly at Mr. Hendricks. "Once I was a very rich man," Mr. Hendricks said. "I spent my money foolishly. Who doesn't when they have more money than they know what to do with? There is a long and not particularly attractive story about how I spent my younger days, but suffice it to say that I was given reason to develop compassion by the time of the great famines." He looked down quickly. Luke saw for the first time that both of his pants legs hung empty below the knee. "I am not disguising anything for you tonight," Mr. Hendricks said softly. Luke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What was he supposed to say? Evidently nothing. Mr. Hendricks went on with his tale. "You know the government was considering letting the undesirables starve, do you not?" Mr. Hendricks asked. "When there is not enough food, who deserves to eat? The blind girl, the deaf boy, the man missing his legs?" The anger in his voice was unbearable. Luke stumbled over his own tongue, ready to say anything to move the story along. "Jason, the one taken away this morning, he told me about that, at school." "Indeed," Mr. Hendricks said. He seemed lost in thought, then roused himself to continue. "My family and I spent millions on bribes to convince the government to have a heart. They left the disabled alone and passed the population law instead." He frowned, stirring his coffee. "And how compassionate had I been? I saved my own kind, knowing that others would likely be killed, so I set up the schools as penance." Mr. Hendricks foresaw what others did not, Mr. Talbot said. He understood that hundreds of illegal children would be born and hidden, and he knew they'd need safe places to go if they were able to come out of hiding. "But I thought your schools were for autistic kids, kids with phobias, the ones who—" Luke stopped. "Oh," he said. Mr. Hendricks chuckled. "So my charade fooled you?" he asked. "Who can tell if a child rocks because he has autism or because he is terrified out of his wits? Who can tell if agoraphobia is caused by oddities in the mind or lifelong warnings? Going outdoors is suicide. In the beginning, yes, I accepted children whose problems stemmed from other causes. I nurtured a reputation as a schoolmaster who would take on any troubled child. And when the first illegal children began emerging, they came here, too." Luke tried to grasp it all. "So everyone's an ex-nay and everyone knows?" he asked. "The teachers, Miss Hawkins in the office, the nurse, all the other boys?" "Oh no," Mr. Hendricks shook his head emphatically. "My charade is complete. I don't even know for sure which boys are which. I don't want to know. There is the possibility of torture," Mr. Talbot said grimly. "Those I don't know, I can't betray," Mr. Hendricks said, "and I hire only employees who seem uniquely capable of ignorance. Teachers so enamored of their academic disciplines that they can't even recognize the students who sit before them for an entire year. Administrative staff whose incompetence is of such towering magnitude that they can't input records into computers and won't notice when files are faked or replaced. There's a certain charm to my system, is there not?" Luke remembered how Jason's portable phone had disappeared, how the doors had been locked, how the files under his 4 friends' new fake names had magically appeared. "But someone knows," he insisted. "There has to be someone who oversees it all." Mr. Hendricks shifted in his wheelchair. "Oh yes, I have my compatriots. Mr. Dirk, as you probably suspect, has been useful upon occasion, although his knowledge is limited. I will tell you no other names." Luke should have felt relieved to finally get an explanation. For that matter, he should have been ecstatic to have an adult at Hendricks acknowledge his existence. But all he could think about suddenly was how lonely and isolated he'd felt his few weeks at Hendricks, how invisible. How low he'd sunk that he'd almost looked forward to Jason picking on him each evening. He felt a surge of anger. "You think you're so great," he said before he could stop himself. "Don't you know how it feels to be an ex-nay? And then you just abandon us among people who don't care or can't care. It's a wonder we don't all run back into hiding." "Oh no," Mr. Hendricks said, seeming totally unruffled by Luke's outburst. "You were never abandoned. I can assume you have never been deep-sea diving, correct?" Luke shook his head and resisted the urge to roll his eyes as well. "But you understand the concept." Mr. Hendricks didn't wait for a reply. "When a diver resurfaces, he has to go gradually, so his body can get accustomed to the changing pressure. Children coming out of hiding need that too. They need places to adjust to the outside world, somewhere that their extreme fear of the outdoors does not seem out of place, somewhere that they can act antisocial and not stand out, somewhere, well, like Hendricks. And then, when they're ready, they move on." "You mean leave?" Luke asked, his voice squeaking in spite of himself. "Yes," Mr. Talbot said. "And Mr. Hendricks and I agree. The events of the past 24 hours prove that your time has come. You're ready to go." Chapter 37. "Huh?" Luke said. He had not anticipated that turn in the conversation at all. Mr. Hendricks leaned forward. "My schools had never been infiltrated before," he said, with a sharp glance at Mr. Talbot. Mr. Talbot frowned apologetically. "The population police have always pretended that it's impossible for an illegal child to get a fake ID," Mr. Talbot added, but after the rally, his eyes clouded. Luke could see the effort he was making to continue without emotion. "After the rally, all the rules changed. So you see, we never expected betrayal," Mr. Hendricks said. "In the beginning, yes, we tiptoed and looked over our shoulders, and fortunately, we kept habits of strong security. But we were not prepared for the population police to plant imposters in our midst, to gather names, to encourage indiscretion." Luke frowned. "But Jason, he said there'd been raids before. He said—" Mr. Talbot had a sarcastic smile on his face. Mr. Hendricks raised one eyebrow. "My dear boy," Mr. Hendricks said, "he lied." Luke grimaced. He didn't like them acting like he couldn't figure that out on his own, but he'd learned a lot from Jason. What was true and what was false? He remembered one of Jason's other explanations. You can't be too nice to an ex-nay. Ex-nays need the kind of friend who can toughen them up, like I did for you. Luke remembered how many times Jason had made him claim to be an idiot, do push-ups until his arms collapsed, make a total fool of himself. Jason hadn't been trying to toughen Luke up. He'd been trying to break him down. But it hadn't worked. Luke didn't know why. He felt breathless, thinking about what could have happened. Suddenly he was mad at Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot, sitting there looking so condescending. "Why didn't you know Jason was an imposter?" Luke said. "You should have. He acted so different from everyone else." "Yes, and so did you," Mr. Hendricks replied quickly. "Should we have suspected you of working for the population police just because you liked going outside?" Luke blinked. "Yes, we knew," Mr. Hendricks said. "Just as we knew Jason, as you call him, was forming a club of former hidden children. We'd never seen that happen before, and frankly, we viewed it as a positive development, until you showed us the truth." Luke remembered how frustrated and frightened and alone he'd felt only the night before. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I tried, but nothing worked. Mr. Talbot deserves all the credit." "You stopped the infiltrator and knocked him out. Then you took him to the nurse who, under the school's protocol, had to alert me," Mr. Hendricks said. "She thought she was just another former hidden child going through some very unusual trauma." Or wait, what? "She thought he was just another former hidden child going through some very unusual trauma. But when he muttered, 'my phone,' she got suspicious. We locked all the doors and made a search of the entire school building." So that's what Jason had muttered to the nurse, Luke thought. He was kind of glad now that he hadn't heard. He had felt panicked enough as it was. "Once we confiscated his phone," Mr. Hendricks continued, "we found out that the last number he called was the population police. Meanwhile, your call made George here suspicious." "Without spelling everything for the bugs on my phone, thank you very much," Mr. Talbot said. "Because of your warning, I had time to double-cross the population police's efforts. So we arrested 2 traitors instead of 6 former hidden children. A good trade in my mind." Luke felt dizzy. No matter how many explanations Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks gave him, other questions sprang up in his mind like so many weeds. Both men were watching him. "Nina," Luke said finally. "Nina was the other traitor." Yes, Mr. Talbot said. Luke thought about how just for a second he'd mistaken Nina for Jen that first night out in the woods. He'd wanted to like Nina so badly. He'd liked the way she'd laughed, but she'd been a traitor too. What will happen to them? Luke asked. Jason and Nina, I mean. Mr. Talbot looked away. Sometimes it's better not to know, he murmured. That meant they were going to be killed, Luke thought. Killed or tortured to death, which was even worse. He shivered. Was it his fault? Was there some way he could have saved the other X-Nays without destroying Jason and Nina? No. They were the ones who had chosen betrayal. This is a cruel business, Mr. Talbot said. Don't dwell on it. In a corner of the room, an old-fashioned clock ticked quietly. Luke gathered his thoughts for his next question. But why did the population police believe you instead of Jason? If he'd wanted to, that officer could have arrested us all, Luke said. He remembered how careful Mr. Talbot had had to be ever since the rally, for fear that someone might connect him with Jen. I thought you were out of favor at Population Police Headquarters right now. No offense, of course, he added quickly. Mr. Talbot shrugged, as though being out of favor was as insignificant as a mosquito bite. I had the evidence on my side, he said. They like evidence. And I have to say, it was a stroke of brilliance to computer enhance that Christmas picture to substitute your face over Jen's. He kept his voice even, saying Jen's name, but Luke noticed that Mr. Hendricks bowed his head reverently, as though giving in to a moment of silent mourning. Had Mr. Hendricks ever met Jen? Luke didn't know, but he found himself lowering his head as well. Jen would have liked that, Luke said, using her picture to fool the population police. He swallowed what might have been a giggle. Jen would have been very amused. And what better way to remember those we love than by doing what they like? Mr. Hendricks asked. Mr. Talbot nodded, silently. Mr. Hendricks took over the explanation. And, young man, you do not realize the power of the name you have been given, Lee Grant. Your father, the father listed on your school records, is a very important man in our society, he said. But he's not my father, Luke said, more forcefully than he intended. I've never even met the man, and I'm not Lee Grant. Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot exchanged glances. Luke wondered if they were deciding he wasn't so ready after all. But you know how to pretend to be Lee Grant, Mr. Hendricks said. That is what matters. Luke shook his head impatiently. He'd suddenly had it with all this double talk. None of this was real. Not the way planting potatoes was or growing beans. It was easier to be a farmer, to know by looking whether your crops were good or not. Still, another question teased at the back of his mind. Why did they do it? He asked. Jason and Nina, why did they betray their friends, their fellow X-Nays? They were never your friends, Mr. Hendricks said harshly. They came to Hendricks and Harlow schools with one purpose and one purpose only, to seek out and betray all the former hidden children they could. They preyed upon all the X-Nays' secret desire to speak their real name, because the population police needed the real names to complete the betrayal. Jason and Nina had never been hidden children. They were just plants, imposters. But the population policemen said they were illegals with false documents, Luke said. The population police can lie too, Mr. Hendricks said grimly. It suits the government's purposes to say they are arresting third children rather than traitors. Luke tried to absorb this. Nina, who spoke so passionately about the third children's cause, Jason, who had talked about protecting X-Nays at Hendricks. They had never been in hiding themselves. They only wanted to harm the ones who trusted them most. This was a level of evil Luke never could have imagined before back on the farm. And now Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot wanted him to go to another new place, some place even more challenging than Hendricks. With all due respect to my friend here, Mr. Talbot nodded toward Mr. Hendricks, we don't really know how Jason and Nina came to work for the population police or why they came to these schools. We're mostly guessing. They're just kids after all. Just kids, Mr. Hendricks protested. You think only adults are capable of such villainy? Naturally, adults must have put them up to it, but I'll be interrogating both of them tomorrow, Mr. Talbot interrupted quietly. Let's just say I intend to discover facts that my population police colleagues probably don't want me to know. It's likely that those two kids were offered substantial bribes for their work, or, he laughed bitterly, maybe they were true believers devoted to their cause. Who knows? Luke wondered about that. Long ago, when he'd first met Jen, he'd wondered if the population law was correct, if maybe he really didn't have any right to exist, to eat food that might go to others. But Jen had convinced him that wasn't so, that everyone had a right to live, no matter what. But what if Jason and Nina had truly believed in what they were doing, even among their enemies? just as Mr. Talbot believed in what he was doing, double-crossing the population police, even as he worked in their headquarters every day. Luke rubbed his temples. This wore his brain out even more than the history test had. He wished everyone could just be what they were and not have to pretend. The clock in the corner began donging, giving off distinguished silvery peals. Luke read the time effortlessly, without having to count dongs. 8 o'clock. Well, Mr. Talbot said, rising, you'll need to get your things out of your room before the other boys come out of, what do you call it, indoctrination, and then I can drive you to your next school tonight. I'll tell you about it on the way. No, Luke said. Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks looked at him in bafflement. Then Mr. Hendricks chuckled. Oh, so you boys have come up with another name for it besides indoctrination. Luke understood the old man's confusion. He could go with that, make up some silly name for indoctrination, pretend that that was all he'd been objecting to, but it wasn't. No, Luke said firmly. I don't want to leave Hendricks. Now Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks absolutely gaped at him, thoroughly aghast. Luke could tell what they were thinking. We gave him a new identity. We gave him a place to hide. We saved his skin today, and now he tells us no? How dare he? Luke gulped. He wasn't so sure how he dared either. Only 2 months earlier, when he'd left home, he'd been a scared little kid, afraid even to speak. He'd had a borrowed name and borrowed clothes, nothing but memories to call his own. But those memories were worth something, and so was he. He wasn't some pawn to be moved across a chessboard according to other people's plans. Luke thought about what he'd accomplished at Hendricks, not just what he'd done to help outsmart Jason, but what he'd done making his garden, trying to make friends, studying for his tests. Jen, you'd be proud, he thought. He tried to figure out how to explain to Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot. I'm glad you want to help me, Luke started softly, and I'm honored that you think I'm ready to leave, but I don't think I'm done here. When I came out of hiding, I told my parents that I wanted to help other third children, only I didn't know how, and now I do. I want to help them here. Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks exchanged glances. Then Mr. Talbot sat down. Tell us more, he said. Chapter 38. The sun was barely over the horizon, but it was already a steamy day. Luke brushed sweat out of his eyes and pushed another seed into the ground. It was late in the season to plant a garden, but they'd had to wait until after exams. Luke could only hope for a late frost in the fall. Behind Luke, 4 other boys clutched a sturdy rope stretched across the garden rows. One boy dipped quickly toward the ground, dropping a seed before he straightened up. Good, Trey, Luke said, laughing, but it's easier if you open your eyes. I might see something that way, Trey grumbled. Everything's so bright out here. Just smell then, Luke suggested. Trey breathed deeply. It's so fresh, he said in a marveling voice. Wait until you taste the peas you're planting, Luke said. Luke was still surprised that Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot had agreed to his plan. I never intended to run an agricultural school, Mr. Hendricks had grumbled. Some of these boys are from the richest families, or supposedly from the richest families. Then they need to know how food grows as much as anyone, Luke answered, surprised at his own tone of authority. Sometimes Luke wondered if he was just taking the easy way out, staying at Hendricks because it was familiar, growing a garden because that's what he liked. But the population law had started over food, so nobody could say that growing food wasn't important. Or maybe that was the problem, that people had started believing it wasn't important. Luke watched Trey plant another seed, this time with his eyes open. This little thing is really going to grow? Trey asked incredulously. Luke nodded. It ought to, he said, and it'll be yours. He hadn't been able to tell Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot how much longer he wanted to stay at Hendricks School. Last week's exams had pointed out plenty of holes in his education, and he knew now that he could learn here. And no matter what, he knew it had to be good for the other boys to get outside. Are you some kind of a teacher? One of the boys behind Trey asked Luke. He spoke hesitantly, like a little kid just learning how to talk. What's your name? Just call me Elle, Luke said without thinking. Now, where had that come from? It wasn't Luke. It wasn't Lee. It was somehow both identities at once, just like Luke himself.